Okay, so as requested / offered for BangShield, this is a video about my attempts at iterating on the vehicle that he built alongside feedback from some other clan mates and even some people from other clans, as far as a, well, as the title wanted, for worm build. So as per their request of keeping the build rather private, none of these 3 builds currently on screen or any of their variants are planned to be available for public use on the exhibition, and likewise this video is going to be listed, or rather unlisted, on the channel, which means that while it is not going to be available for being just found generically, using the link is still going to supply people with access to the video, which is going to be the method I'm going to be using to share not only with BangShield themselves, but potentially they are able to then share with anybody else who is potentially of interest, who would want to check out the video or the build, or potentially turning it public later on, which should allow the share URL to still be valid. So I'm hoping that it's working as a unlisted video. I don't know how I would check that, but for the sake of me having selected it as unlisted in the settings, hopefully it works. I think the lack of it showing up on here is also an indication that it seems to be working that way. I guess we'll have to see. In any case, this is looking at the... Oh yuck, why do you rescale? Why would I do that? I'm just not going to do that that easy. Or maybe it's because of... That's 100% because of that. Nice, excellent, cool. So looking at the original vehicle that was supplied by BangShield, so this is one that they've used a few times. I think most notably in the arena game mode is where I saw them use it the most frequently, where it's essentially a humpback build with worms, or sorry, a humpback worm build with whirls, which potentially can have them swapped out for the Caucasus. So this is basically just a direct rip of the version that he had. So this is one he uploaded to exhibition. I downloaded it, and then all of my attempts at changing it were put in other slots. As a result, because BangShield is running a fused humpback cabin for mass, and I don't have one, as you can see, it lacks the star. It's just a CK. And then it was also missing a couple of stickers, but effectively this was the build that they had. Also, very interesting to note, in my eyes at least, that while it can be swapped out with the Caucasus, the Worlds have a mass of 729. And people are apparently vacuuming next door. And the Caucasus has a mass of 743. So actually going and adding the Caucasus to this build, or rather swapping them out, would actually have made it even more over encumbered, which isn't my goal, isn't the case. So, or what I was looking to do. So to start with, my first initial thoughts on the build, which are already something I've discussed with BangShield himself when we were playing earlier today. It's also surprisingly dark on this screen compared to my TV, which is unfortunate. But in any case, to look at the basics of it, it has a bootstrap generator, which allows the humpback to go up to 14 energy total. That allows for 3 whirls at 4 energy each, including one of them being fused from the Doomsday Battle Car Pass, although it doesn't really help a whole lot in the confines of the build as a whole. And then there's additionally a averter module. So that is attached to, at least in the variant that BangShield has, both the cabin at the top and the bootstrap at the bottom, which gives him some resistance to, or I guess rather the side, which gives him some resistance to things like fire petals from incinerators. So underneath, the final energy point is spent on a RN seal, and then there is a bunch of heavy armor pieces which serve to increase the durability of the vehicle by a significant amount, as well as some buggy pieces which the weapons are directly attached to. Overall, a pretty simple concept, although not very easy to execute. I certainly asked for this build off of him because I didn't have the first idea on how to go about starting on making a sort of worm build, and he's been iterating on it for quite a while. I mean, I don't even know when the arena game mode was, but at least a couple of months ago. So this is something that he's obviously put a lot of love, effort, and thought into. And I'd had some interesting thoughts on making a likewise build of my own and any potential sort of changes I could make to it. So I figured it'd be easy to just get it off of him and then work from there, which is also why I'm basically making this video, for his interest of me taking the build and working on it. So to begin with, I'd had a few thoughts on how it was weird to use the large fenders for armoring around the whirls, because the Bartizan fenders, which are from the Scavenger's Prestige but are a Steppenwolf part, interestingly enough, actually fit a lot more snugly to the weapon. Instead of being 4 in depth, they're only 3, while still maintaining a 6 length and a 2 height. They also have pretty close ratios as far as the durability, mass, and power score, all in correlation to one another. That being said, they did have less pronounced different effects before the power score / durability rework of structural parts a few months ago, so they're a little bit more distinct now. But in any case, for the ability to shorten the build up overall significantly, I figured that that would be a not terrible route to go. So if I replace those and save 2 pips of space on either side, so shortening the overall build by 6. So if I were to go about slapping the cabin back on, you can see that allows me to move it up. And rinse repeat for overall a very much shorter build. This is also something that allows me to sort of not say correct, but tighten up the frame pieces a little bit more. I guess the buggy pieces, since they're literally not frame pieces, but the buggy pieces for the connection to the whirls underneath, because instead of using the multiple different smaller buggy pieces, I'm able to reuse the larger buggy floors instead. So for instance, I can go and do something like that, and even move the Iron Seal one up, so it's a little bit more embedded and less likely to die as a result of being hit by fire underneath the build due to its rather low durability. So that was my first change I wanted to make, basically tightening up the build quite a bit, which did let me to push all these other things in, which I'm not currently going to do. Now, this created a problem I had been blissfully unaware of, though, when I first made these changes. So, while the whirls are still able to rotate, they actually aren't able to go around each other for the front and middle whirls. So you can only actually have them effectively used on one side. So my next thought was, okay, well maybe I do need to space them out a little bit, so I can kind of just undo some of those changes. And if, say, it only needs 1 extra space per whirl, I can merely go back and replace the middle whirl with 2 large fenders. So this will then let the second and third whirl shoot over one another, and therefore rotate over the others, making it a little bit easier. But the first one still has the issue where for it to rotate from the right to left side of the vehicle, it has to go all the way around the back. Now, if you're aiming forward with it, which is very likely to be the case while you're moving, that leads for a significant time difference by pretty much a factor of 3 or 4 here of me trying to rotate the front wheel around. Now, especially on a worm build where people are very likely to try and get in front of your cabin so that the guns don't have angles, it doesn't really work when I have to constantly aim left or right, especially with the whirl already having a relatively slow rotation speed. That doesn't quite work out. Now, the problem with solving this, quote-unquote, is the amount of space the whirl needs. So it doesn't only have 3 pips needed, because you also could have theoretically shortened that up, like I had originally tried, but it still needs all 4 pips that BangShield had on here originally. So even with the implementation of the large fender, there's still a bit of unseemly space up front here, especially as a result of not being a power of 2 size, of it being a 3x8 rather than say a 2x8 or a 4x8. It doesn't end up fitting very well at all. As a result of me having to use the heavy fender on the front as well, I also have to use them on the back and kind of carry it down the line, which basically overall hurts the ability to sort of compress stuff again. So I could now look at replacing the front and back whirl armors with the large fenders. Which I'm going to do poorly here just for the sake of showing it a lot more quickly. And this then gives them their freedom to rotate all the way around, including the one on the front. That being said, there's still a significant speed difference between going up and around the other guns and just going straight across, which again is a lot more noticeable as a result of the slow turn speed of the whirls and the nature of it being a warm build where it's not infrequent that some of your sight lines are blocked. So that's all to say that there was not an insignificant amount of thought and effort put into making the whirl position and the overall length of the build compact and work and armored well. As a side note, I thought it might be interesting to use the large fenders upside down regardless of where you put them, just because I think it looks a little bit nicer when it's flush to the top rather than rounded. So if I go on and slap the armor color, I feel like that looks a little bit better than that, but I mean, obviously to each their own. And that's all just work just for the absolute basics of armoring the guns. So there is a bunch of other stuff I ended up poking around with doing. So likewise, I felt like while the averter was quite useful, it would be a lot more helpful to have a golden eagle on the build in order to get its speed up. Now, while I didn't want to necessarily remove the averter, the addition of the eagle requires another energy point so long as heavy cabins only have 11 energy. So it's the sort of thing that I figured, okay, well, why not just replace the bootstrap with the Apollo, get the extra energy, slap a Geagle on. Reason being, because I'm already running the Hans co-driver for the movement part durability and the vehicle durability, I'm getting a +5 kph perk for the cabin anyway as a Steppenwolf cabin. So it's actually able to go 65 instead of 60 by default, and the addition of the engine would allow it to go up to 70. And as well, as a result of being the Geagle engine whose perk is to increase the speed of augers, it allows the augers to go from 60 to 70, which is normally the limit for this build, and allowing you to overall go 70 kph, which is a fair click faster, especially as overall a relatively slow, heavy, tanky build. So as a result of the attempts at making those changes alongside some specific choices for doing different armoring options, and my compensation for the lack of the humpback cabin being fused via the addition of another auger, which likewise, even without the engine, is sort of needed for this build and its mass due to my lack of having the cabin fused, and then taking the fuel tank off. That leads to my naming for it, which is the Whirlum, and you can see for the modules, like I said, the addition of the Giggle, the addition of another auger in order to increase the max mass and thus allow the carrying of these other parts, including the new Apollo engine and the new Apollo generator instead of the bootstrap, but otherwise very similar as far as having the 3 whirls, having the RN seal, having the averter, and then using likewise mostly the same armor parts. So the addition of the 5th auger I decided would make sense to go on the front due to there not really being anything there at the moment, and having it centered was sort of just an obvious choice for allowing it to spin in symmetrical fashion either way, not really being hindered by one direction. As a result of the overall shape of it, before I added the frames and the flails, I sort of decided, wow, it's really starting to look like a warship now. So I just kind of leaned into that and made it angled, and then added the fuselage bumper on the front. I also ended up moving, for comparison's sake, moving the front 2 augers to the back, as one can see, and then tightening up the back tail, making it a little bit more blunt and not nearly as long as BangShield had it. As a result, this means that there is more direct armor, quote-unquote, via the augers around the whirls on all sides, with any corresponding limitations as a result of that. So this was using the original idea I had for shortening stuff, using the Bartizan fenders. I'm not entirely sold on, again, if this is the better route to go. My main concern with re-adding the fenders is how much further it's going to shove back the whirls. So needing an additional 2 pips to the front poses a couple of risks for basically having all of your weapons hanging out the back some more, making them a lot more easy to see and shoot from the front, and then the center of gravity of the entire build shifting and thus it not being able to rotate in place as easily. That being said, simply moving the humpback cabin forward the 2 pips necessary for at least the front whirl to rotate seems to work out okay. As far as all of the frames, it's still touching the same ones as before when it was located here, although obviously they are a little bit more exposed from potential gunfire to the sides, front and back. So this is probably the best compromise I had figured for it, which I didn't end up saving, so the humpback was obviously set back a little bit there. But otherwise didn't change a whole lot of stuff at the frame level. I did move the frames a little bit further back on the sides just as a result of adding those additional augers, so I did need to go a little bit deeper than in the worm where it just needed to touch the front ones by the very tip. I needed to wrap around the side of the build a little bit longer. As far as armoring underneath, just going to use a big ram here to prop it up. I had stuck with very much the same idea, using primarily the APC parts. As a result of pushing the RN seal up and underneath the first whirl, that gave me a little bit more space in order to slap the Apollo in the gap, added the space for the Giggle, and then turned the averter sideways. So this fits in my eyes a lot more nicely for the sake of having the Apollo, but unfortunately the averter's now not really touching anything else. So it's not really boosting anything other than explicitly the cabin and this one frame, which is kind of a semi-redundant one anyway. So it's not really the best use case of the inverter in my eyes, but it still does apply it to the cabin, which I think is the main benefit of it. The Apollo being, well, the Apollo tends to be pretty protected overall from what I've seen. And then obviously the Giggle allows me to move significantly faster. As a result of using the additional augers on the side, and then the narrowing via the Giggle, and then the tucked in meat grinder up front, once again me trying to limit the overall length of the vehicle by not having this auger stick out its entire front length. I did get a odd number of pips left on the side, so my original thought was to do 2 tram car doors as a result of this being 14 long. After the APC parts in half wall, I can just fit these together because it allows me to fit the 2 parts in a gap of 15, which is an odd number, of course, and normally you can't fit any 2 single parts in there since they all, again, tend to be a base power of 2, or power of 2, rather. But the Giggle being sort of lopsided fitting that space it has on either side, once again limits it. It's something where I could potentially look at revamping it a little bit more if and when I'm able to fuse the humpback. But this is sort of the main version, the main takeaway that I have from BangShield's, which is basically just tightening up the whirls a little bit, adding the extra auger, and then jostling around some of the stuff underneath after adding the Apollo and Giggle. So I'll just remove this. Now, as a result of already making the build longer and adding the single front auger and not having a fused humpback, it raised the question of, okay, well, if I do fuse the humpback, what else is the sort of stuff I can use with it? The logical conclusion to that, in my eyes, was, well, I would have additional mass limit and then could benefit from additional tonnage, so I might as well look at making one with 6 augers instead. So this is one that, again, doesn't end up working without having the fused humpback, and as such isn't really functional at the moment. More so an idea than anything else, and still very much in, I guess you could say, development if I have further ideas for it. But it once again looks at pushing the augers back to the rear of the build, fully encompassing the whirls. So just for comparison's sake there, the augers are moving back with the whirls. The whirls are spread out to their original spacing where they didn't have any overlap with each other, unlike the second build. I did also end up widening the middle pair of augers, which allowed me to make it a little bit more symmetrical. Once again, connect multiple frames to the humpback a little bit more easily, and then having them wider also allowed me to have the augers a little bit closer together without having any sort of overlap. So this is currently the sort of end design I have with it. It doesn't really have any armoring under the front, and there's been some changes to armor otherwise, just again due to the mass limit, which ideally would change if and when the humpback gets fused. But I have the same sort of setup as before here, with all the frame pieces, and then using APC side parts. Notably, because the addition of the meat grinders being spaced out gave me more space underneath, I decided to swap out some APC parts, mostly because I'm almost out, for crane sides, and would likewise probably do the same up front if and when again I have mass here. So this is currently the heaviest iteration I have for it. It's also the one that I tested in hard raids, which seemed to do okay. Obviously bots only focusing your cabin, and thus 100% of damage you take going there, rather than being somewhat diluted by the augers or the weapons or misses, means that it didn't perform as well as the other heavier builds I've had that might have less health and less resistance, but have more damage and more damage output, as well as more damage soaked up by other parts of the build. But like, it still did kind of work for the hard raid. So going forward for things I want to do with it, other than obviously get the humpback fusion, is I kind of want to look at its viability. Once again, my concerns with this are that it really is too long. I did end up having the narrowed front slope again, just again to help with the shape of it and rotation, considering how the center of gravity is further back. In addition to allowing me to have more of a nose on the front, that would hopefully shift things out of the way and to the side and to the back where they're more shootable, as opposed to a sort of flat nose where there's more risk of things getting stuck. So currently what I can do for the hard raid specifically is just remove those 3 parts, and then that's what I was doing for taking them into the raid. But of course too, there's going to be limited viability for a build that's only running epic weapons up until the 11,000 power score bracket. So for those who aren't familiar with it, on Xbox at least, going above 10,000 basically lumps you in with anyone from 10 to 18,000 power score, depending on the day and the matchmaking and whatnot. So I generally try and avoid that as much as possible. Now, that being said, since this isn't explicitly a build that I'm bringing into PvP, since I already have the epic autocannon trial complete, it's something where it's beefy enough. I could see it maybe working if you had a group of people doing it. But explicitly for success, I think the original variant that BangShield had at the lower power scores is more likely to succeed. Other things as far as armor specifically that I'd be looking at updating, which I haven't yet, is taking a look at the spreadsheeting that I've done for the structural part calculator for Crossout. So instead of just slapping on a bunch of the heavier parts because they give a lot of durability, looking at the actual calculations of what ends up being the best for the power score, and then what also ends up being the best for volume and for mass, since obviously those are also very real limiters for these builds. I say as I realized that I didn't end up showing it. But looking at those as well, looking at the calculations for actually which parts would work, which have the best sort of ratios, rather than just slapping on the largest, biggest, heaviest parts I could find, or I guess rather that BangShield could find. So that's the other sort of couple of things mostly to look at for the smaller builds. Looking at the bigger build, again, the fusion, what sort of other armor I can add without compromising it, especially, again, with the mass limits. And then sort of where I'd look to have it be viable for the sake of PvP versus just raids, which is where I'd be primarily using this currently. And that being said, this wasn't explicitly the goal of me picking up the whirls anyway. I have another build in mind, but I figured that, hey, well, if I have the 3 whirls in the humpback anyway, BangShield has been running this type of build, the worm, for quite a while. I'd figure it out, take a look through it, and see if there's anything that I could or would want to change. So yeah, this is kind of just the result of that. So very simple for the sake of getting the frames, using as large and heavy pieces as I can, wrapping the augers around that to try and reduce the overall length of the build, and then fitting the modules in and around underneath alongside the armor after that, and trying to get up as close to that mass limit as possible. Pretty straightforward. I expect it's the sort of thing where it's a build that BangShield is probably going to spend a significant amount of time continuing to iterate on it. So who knows, this might end up, any one of these builds might end up changing significantly afterwards, but I'm pretty happy with the variants I have now, and you know, looking forward, we'll have to see how it ends up being improved or what ends up having to be reworked dependent on what other parts I end up using.